Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Time Fit Impact podcast. You'll notice it's me, Matt, in the chair doing the introductions today. Chris is here, but Chris is going to be joining us today as a member of our panel as we explore a topic today which hopefully many of you will find interesting, which is about the integration of HR and volunteering functions and some of the things and some of the big topics which surround that, really. I'm joined by three fantastic guests today, and I'll get them to introduce themselves. So the first one, many of you will be familiar with already. Chris, over to you.
I'm Chris Wade from Time for Impact. Amongst other things, beyond running this podcast, I help organisations develop their volunteering strategies, improve their volunteering systems and their volunteering experience, and particularly focus on helping organisations demonstrate the strategic value and impact of volunteering for their organisations. Previous to that, relevant to this podcast, I guess, especially, is that I have been people director for a large national charity, CEO of smaller charities, and head of volunteering, and involved in volunteering at both director and trustee levels for very many years, including stints with Volunteering England and NCVO.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm also joined by Helen Timbrell. Helen, over to you.
Hello. So I work as an independent consultant and researcher and a coach. My background is as a director of volunteering in large volunteer involving organisations, and then a director of people and organisational development.
Thanks, Helen. And last but certainly not least, Rob Jackson. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. Rob Jackson. So I run Rob Jackson Consulting Limited, which is an independent consultancy training firm based out of Lincolnshire, and had the very great pleasure of working with Matt and Helen and Chris over many years, but particularly for the context of this conversation with Helen and Chris last week at the event that we hosted in Swindon.
Thanks, Rob. That's brilliant. So let's get stuck in. And I don't know who wants to jump in to answer this, but I guess you might all have your own reflections on this. We've run an event. We've been talking about sort of HR and volunteering functions. You put this together. It was a brilliant day. I was there. I really enjoyed it. I'd be interested if someone could set the scene for us. Why was this day needed? Why now? And why did it take the kind of shape it did from your perspectives? Chris, do you want to kick us off?
I can, and I'm sure the others will join in, and not least Helen, because I think Helen was probably central to start the formation of this idea. So she'll correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think Helen called both Rob and I up initially quite separately, or at least we had conversations separately, but running kind of parallel. And I think we'd all been around the sector for, let's say, for a few years now, many years, maybe many decades. And have increasingly seen a trend where volunteering staffing functions have been sitting or moving into an HR or people or combined people function. And I think it's fair to say that some volunteer teams really love that and some are less keen. But I think at least my reflection was, well, there were lots of models and lots of ways to put volunteering into an organisation, lots of ways to structure that. But if HR or people or combined people function is a way that many organisations are going, then it feels incumbent on us to actually help the sector explore that possibility and get the most from it where it happens. So I think we came at it from a very positive viewpoint to say, well, you know, this is one of many models. Let's make sure it works for volunteers. Let's make sure it works for staff. What was your reflection, Helen, maybe?
Yeah, so I would say that's probably broadly about right. And the origins go back a bit. So it's interesting, Matt, you say, why did we do it and why did we do it now? Because in some regard, we've been really slow. I was just looking, Rob, you and I did a podcast about this that went live in February 2023. So we've not really rushed at the topic. We've not really rushed at having an event. And in that podcast in February 2023, so it was Rob's podcast, Advancing the Profession, and Rob had invited me on as a guest to share some of my experiences and reflections of when HR and volunteering come together. And then, just as Chris says, in the last couple of years, I've been doing quite a lot of consultancy projects in organisations where organisations invite me in and they are at various stages of integration. And sometimes they don't invite me in to look at integration, they invite me in to look at a particular issue in volunteering or a particular issue in change. But when you start the consultancy work and you're doing the diagnostic work to understand what's happening in the organisation, often one can trace some of the origins of current situations back to how an integration was managed or not. So we were just really fascinated by that for a long time, all three of us. And yeah, I think, as I think Rob said on Friday, I may have at some point gone, chaps, what would it look like if we did an event around this? Do we think anyone other than the three of us are interested in this? And then it turned out that quite a lot of people were interested and came along on.
Pace is our friend now. That's good. We're hot off the mark now. Before you come in, Rob, I just wanted to say, and maybe this will tee you up a little bit, but like that podcast you mentioned, if anyone is listening, I would really, really recommend listening to that conversation between Rob and Helen. I've certainly passed that on to other people as well to listen to, because there's some really interesting themes explored in that, which are really pertinent to this topic.
Let's put it in the show notes then.
Yeah, let's do that. We'll definitely do that.
Great.
Rob, any thoughts from you on this? Clearly, that's something you've been thinking about as well.
Yeah. It was the 11th of November 2022 we recorded that podcast, Helen. So literally 2 years and 4 days after we recorded that podcast, we did the event. I suppose from my perspective, my particular interest in it came up around 2014, 2015. I mean, inevitably, the kind of juxtaposition of HR people and volunteering has been around for a lot longer than that. But in 2015, with Susan Ellis, I published the UK edition of her book, From the Top Down. And there's a whole section that we talk about in there. Where do you put volunteering? Because this is a book aimed at chief exec, senior leaders. So where do you put the volunteering function in an organisation? And one of the places that we talk about is the HR function, the personnel function, the people function. And very briefly, we kind of touch on some of the pros and cons of that. So if it's a really compliance-driven culture, it's not going to work really well, but it's also a kind of natural fit, because if you put it in fundraising, everybody thinks volunteering is fundraising. If you put it in ops, everybody thinks volunteering is to do with operations. And that kind of trend has obviously continued for a while, and we've had some organizations where the lead person on all of that has been more of a volunteering person with an HR angle, although that's pretty unusual. It's tended to be the other way around. But the other debate that quite often, or the other issue that I quite often come across in organisations, not necessarily the really big nationals, but probably the kind of more medium-sized organisations, is where the volunteer manager, coordinator, whatever we want to call them, is expected to line manage all the volunteers. And I quite often kind of challenge that by saying that's like asking the HR manager or the people director to line manage all the paid staff. And so there is this kind of parallel increasingly with the volunteering function being like an HR function for volunteering. So when Helen and Chris had a conversation and they came to me in February and said, look, this might be an event, are we interested? It was quite interesting to me to do it, but also from the angle that we took, which is, this isn't something that we're going to push with volunteering professionals. This is something we're going to push with HR professionals, which is not necessarily my day-to-day wheelhouse. My stuff tends to be more the volunteering side. But I think it led to some really interesting conversations.
Yeah, and I should add as well, I'd certainly had conversations with HR directors and HR professionals who were coming at this from that angle, that just from an individual point of view, that they've been given the volunteering brief, not always asked for it. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't, but they've not often been given the skills, the training and the support, or even the definition of quite what they're trying to achieve through such a structure. It's incredibly intelligent people, but it's not necessarily their forte to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I think we felt, didn't we? We reflected on being in kind of volunteering focused CPD environments, continuing professional development environments, whether that's kind of webinars or conferences or workshops, and hearing volunteering professionals talk about this topic and provide each other with support and share some ideas, still pretty limited, but we could see that was happening to some extent in the volunteering world. But Chris and you and I have been in the broader people HR world, and I couldn't see anywhere where there was anything that was specifically focused on trying to provide support, an equivalent support and space and care for people who were coming from more of the HR perspective and wanting, a big thing that we talked about when we were putting it together was, I banged on about, the chaps will tell you, was about tone of voice for the whole thing. And I've been around this topic long enough to know that some HR professionals may have felt that they were about to be told off by a bunch of volunteering professionals for not doing this properly. And we were really clear, and I was like a dog with a bone about that is not the tone and the spirit that we are after here. We are after a tone and a spirit of mutual respect and and I said all this on Friday, right? Mutual respect and kindness that recognises that both professions have lots to contribute, related but different, but have also been challenged by these integrations in ways that perhaps their organisations haven't supported them well enough.
I thought like that particular part, as sitting there as a participant, as a volunteering professional, I thought like without a background in HR, my personal view is the balance of that was really nice, because I think sometimes we as a sort of volunteering profession can sometimes be a bit guilty of kind of making ourselves a poor relation sometimes. And I think that didn't feel to me like the way the day came across. I thought there was a real good kind of balance between how can we achieve a situation which is kind of like win-win for everyone, and where the things we know and the things we're working on kind of are complementing each other rather than sort of competing with each other for resources or time or expertise. And it feels like that's a challenge that is going to be increasingly pertinent to organizations, actually, with the way the volunteer landscape is at the moment, with the way the charity sector landscape is, with some of the decisions that lots of organizations are having to make going forwards about how they structure themselves to deliver the best for the people they're here to support. And I wonder if that brings us on relatively nicely to some of the things you talked about, Rob, in the sense of the kind of the volunteer landscape and some of the key things that, perhaps if you're not in the weeds of volunteering, the key things perhaps it's useful for you to know about the sector and some of the challenges we're facing at the moment in terms of volunteering.
Yeah, so we thought it was really important to clarify with everybody just at the start. So we had about 45 people there, probably about 10 of whom were volunteer engagement professionals like yourself and myself, Matt. And we thought it was really important to start everybody off on the right foot when it comes to the kind of reality of volunteering at the moment. And we made it really clear on the day, actually, that the reason we were doing that is because the vast majority of people in the room were HR professionals, and they probably know the current state of employment and HR situation across the sector, but they didn't necessarily know the kind of volunteering context. So we basically talked about the data that's out there on volunteering. So the stuff that we know from the Community Life Survey in England, the stuff that we know from the Time Well Spent Survey. So you look at the trend lines at the moment, formal and informal volunteering is in decline. Fewer people are giving their time, and when they do, they're giving less time than they ever did beforehand. Volunteering New Zealand coined the phrase earlier this year, is becoming much more casual, at least initially. Therefore, any organisation that has in the past thrived on volunteering, that is very much built around that kind of regular, committed, probably older profile of volunteer coming forward, is increasingly struggling to meet its volunteering goals because those people are not volunteering quite so more. So that requires our organisations to be much more flexible, to be much more adaptable, to in some ways actually, and we talked about this on the day as well, take much more of a kind of community action, community activist-led approach, which is really interesting because, number one, that's challenging for a lot of volunteer engagement professionals who've worked in kind of well-established organisations. But number two, it's not necessarily traditionally an HR skill set. So if you've got volunteering and HR co-located, and volunteering is having to kind of go off in this direction, what does that mean for the culture around engaging people in the organisation, the support that the volunteer engagement professionals can be provided with by managers in the HR function, all of that kind of stuff. So we talked about flexibility. We talked about the need for organisations to collaborate much more in engaging volunteers because we're not competing with each other. We looked at some of the barriers people say are there around volunteering. So we know people today are feeling, certainly compared to the lockdowns, that volunteering is taking up too much of their time, that volunteering is too much like paid work, it's too overly formal and bureaucratic. And how do we begin to kind of square the circle of some of those challenges within the sector? So that's really kind of what the opening gambit of the whole session was, to get people on that page, so that when we're talking about integration, when we're talking about the other things, we're one group of people coming at it from a common understanding.
Can I build on that a wee bit?
Of course.
Because one of my reflections over the weekend is we struggled in putting the day together overall, right? Because we knew we were going to have a lot to talk about and people would want to talk about a lot. So we knew we were going to run short of time. If we had had more time, I think it would have been really valuable to dig in more with that community of people into that. So if volunteering needs to feel more like community participation and movement building and more casual, what does that mean for the direction of travel we're taking it in terms of increasingly aligning some of our systems and processes around HR systems and processes? I feel like there is still a lot to unpack in there. At the end of the day, one of the participants, who was from a volunteering background, came to speak to me, and they said, it's just really made me think about that kind of product development was their language, product development in volunteering in order to respond to the sorts of trends that you were sharing, Rob. And what that person was saying was, because I'm in a broader HR people directorate now, so my peers as leaders in there don't come from that background and actually aren't that interested, not in a sort of, dismissive, not interested, but it's not where they need to spend their time at the moment. So I'm already planning the next one, but that felt like we kind of flagged it and people could see it, but we probably couldn't and would in future dive into that even more.
And what's interesting is them using that product language. And that product language was something that Joe Saxton was using in his new Alchemy report 10 years ago. Yeah. So whilst the angle you took that on is very different, Helen, it does reinforce that point that these are issues that have been around for a long time, whether the volunteering function has been in HR or not. So it's not the fault, for want of a better phrase, of co-location and partnership with HR. It's a bigger issue that needs to be kind of grappled with within the sector. And what we were doing on Friday was starting to look at that through the lens of the HR volunteering integration. But we're already planning the next event already, aren't we? So.
And there's only so much time in an event, isn't there? And I personally would love to have heard more reflections from the audience, from the HR professionals. Who, I feel for everyone listening, were pretty senior HR leaders, most of them as well. I'd kind of like to have heard from them about how much of this is new. Did we understand this? What does it mean to them from a leadership angle in terms of how they would need to shape their functions slightly differently now if they have learned something new about the volunteering world, the need for more of a sort of marketing approach to recruiting volunteers, or the need for more involvement and different approaches to motivation and building communities and so on. I'd like to have heard from them rather than just from us a bit more. Actually, what does this mean for the way I'm shaping my HR team? But of course, we had one day.
The thing I was going to add to what you said, Chris, was, to me, it may be, because there's quite a literal reflection on, is the way we've structured our teams the right way forward? But I think there's a nuance to that. So one very senior leader who was there on the day, who came from a HR background in an integrated team, came and spoke to me and said, this session has made me completely rethink the style and tone of how I am about to approach an important piece of work. So even that, even if what it does is shifts the style and tone that someone takes regardless of their structure. Because making structural change is big and messy, and we should only do that when it's the only kind of answer, right? Often people go to structural change because it looks impressive and it feels like the answer to everything. So if actually what the session did was not necessarily led to a conversation or a thought around needing to adjust a structure, but it absolutely landed a sense of a different style or a different tone to a really important piece of work, I take that every time as a win for that event, I think.
Absolutely.
So my reflections on the conversation we've just had now, and some of the things I took away from the day, it feels to me are almost a nice bridge between what you talked about on the day, Rob, and what you talked about, Helen. So, Rob, this kind of piece of like, there's a lot of stuff out there. How do we absorb all of that, and how do we work out what we're going to do with it? To me, really builds into what you were talking about, Helen, which is like this idea that like context is really key. And I've used that at least 3 times today in various meetings I've had. And it for me, it's a really important thing to like ground ourselves in, actually, because there is all of this stuff out there, and that will mean different things to different organizations about the state of volunteering, about the state of the charity, about how integrated or not they are, or where they are on that journey, about what kind of volunteer involving organization you are, about what kind of culture you have, about how you're, where you are with your staff, where you are with your organizational priorities. So what you do with all of that landscape stuff that Rob provided feels to me like context is really key in making those choices. And I wondered if that might give us a nice segue into your part of the day, and to explain, some of the things you were touching on around almost like to integrate or not, and some of the challenges around that.
Yeah. So all right. So Rob beautifully set that kind of context of this is what's going on in the volunteering world, and then the session I led, I guess I positioned it as reflections from having been in organisations with varying levels of integration and consulting to lots of organisations about varying levels of integration. And what I was trying to do was land the message that context matters. There's not one answer or one way of doing this, and thoughtful consideration of many aspects of your current charity context are really important when planning this work. I was then trying to be really clear about make sure you plan this work. So not just what you're going to do, but what is it you're trying to achieve with this integration. And a real reflection from consulting around lots of this and therefore working across lots of different organizations is that often why the change is being made, why the integration is happening is either not clear enough in terms of what does success look like, what are the goals, or even if that is clear, the rationale and those goals aren't clearly articulated for all of the stakeholders. And so then that can risk creating some, at best, lack of understanding, at worst, kind of digging of heels in and resistance, because people don't get why it's happening or what good's going to look like. And then what I did was shared some very crude models, what I have made up based on my experience in organisations around different ways in which integration might show up. So I had a kind of model of A to E, ideal types of what integration might look like, from not at all, volunteering sits entirely separately in a different part of the organisation, right through to fully integrated, there's no volunteering specialists, everyone in people is doing staff and volunteering. And for people who were not there, we did a lovely line-up exercise involving all of the participants lining up in a row around the extent to which they were or were not integrated. And what I think for me was fascinating about that was 2 things. A, the kind of the breadth of different examples. So the range, there were people from one person who described themselves as minus A, so not even at the very beginning, to people at the far end in a group of, 44, 45 people. So I was really struck by how stretched out that lineup was. And then also organisations that had more than one person there, members of staff standing in different place on that line. So different members of staff in the same organisation having different views about how integrated or not volunteering in HR was in their organisation. Those things just felt really fascinating for me in terms of almost highlighting your point, Matt, about context is everything. There isn't one way to do this.
It's interesting, isn't it, that when and reflecting back on it from last week, when we talk about integration, we talk about that being a team where HR and volunteering engagement professionals collaborate together, work together within a department. Actually, some of what we're seeing at the moment, because of the financial pressures under organisations, is integration in the sense of, well, volunteers are just people, aren't they? So we can do away with the volunteering function altogether and just have the HR function run volunteering. Now, one might almost argue that's the ultimate integration at the far end of it. I don't think it is, because I think there's a different but complementary skill set, and you touched on that in your remarks on Friday, Helen. But I do think that it was interesting that there was a sense of a journey from everybody in the room towards, and it was a I do similar kind of lineup exercises on other things, but it was the kind of thing where one person went right off to the one end, yes, we're fully integrated. One person went right off to the other end, that like, no, we're nowhere near. And then there's just this big gaggle in the middle, all trying to figure out where they sit on this continuum. So there's clearly a lack of clarity. Yeah.
It's how quickly people got to extremes. If they were in an extreme of we're not at all integrated or we're entirely integrated, how quickly they got to those. And it was the folks at the most extreme end who were least happy with where they were, or more openly expressed that they were not comfortable with where their organisation currently was, right? It was at the extremes. It was like proper bell curve. The extremes were the people who were like slightly head in their hands about where they were for different reasons. Whereas the people who were kind of more in the middle-ish generally seemed more content with their current position. That's not very scientific. But I mean, a lineup's not a very scientific methodology, but my sense was, you guys are nodding, that, yeah, the people at the extremes were not celebrating their extreme positions, were they?
I thought some of the examples we heard from some of the speakers were also really interesting. I guess the starting point on like where this can bring genuine advantages, resources being a key thing emphasized. But also it felt like in the room there was also this really sort of positive expression to kind of be open to what could be, but also be open to like what is and isn't working about integration or not. So the best place is proceeding thoughtfully with your context in mind and being aware of the areas where this could bring advantage, but also the areas where this could bring disadvantage, and taking care with those things to make sure you can maximize the benefits and mitigate the risks of that.
And I think that's spot on. I think what you saying that has reminded me of the really valuable contribution we had from one of the participants at the end of the day, who asked us to, not just the three of us, but asked all of us in the room to remember that sometimes these integration moves are driven by cost saving and headcount reduction. And that creates a very particular context where doing the kind of planned, thoughtful, considered, incremental, careful approach may not be always available in the way that we might want when we're leading those things, but was also, I think, what that person was doing when reminding us of that context was also reminding us that there's a whole set of emotions that go for people if integration is coming from a restructure and posts being at risk and potential redundancy. That is going to make it really hard to keep hold of the spirit of kind of openness and kindness and working in partnership. If you're at risk at redundancy through an integration, of course that is going to impact on how you feel about it, and it is important to remember that context, I think.
And I still remember my Prince 2 training, just about. And I always remember that concept of continuous justification. And I wonder if that's the one that we sometimes lose track on in projects like this, is because the importance of delivering them and the outcome of integration, whatever level of integration that may be, can become mutable. You can't shift it. And actually, that you still need to make sure, well, actually, is it going to deliver the outcomes we're expecting through this project? And it's quite hard from a power imbalance point of view to move away from that position once it's been set. And I think by what you talked about, Helen, by really focusing people on context, which in some ways is what is this going to deliver in terms of benefits, I think helps them make sure you're not just going for more integration, you're going for the right integration. that delivers. And I think it's something we all forget when we do these sort of projects.
I think your use of the word power is really helpful and interesting, because that's also something we didn't talk about on Friday. I think all of us would say, on the basis of the work we do now as consultants, but also our experiences in organisations, that it is rare for it to feel, when those two teams come together in whatever formation, that is a partnership of equal power and influence at that time. And volunteering is often the part of that pairing that has less power and influence. And again, that feels like one of those important points to just to notice, right? Just to acknowledge as part of that context. And I guess that's partly, it's sort of a link to how I ended my section, which was just some of those questions that I wanted to challenge the group with around, in those integrated models, are senior roles in integrated people teams genuinely as open to people from a volunteering background as an HR background? If to be a senior leader in an integrated people function, you have to have CIPD qualifications, or you have to have extensive experience of line management of paid staff, not just volunteers, for example. Are organisations consciously or unconsciously building a glass ceiling for volunteering professionals in their careers? I do think there's something about just shining a light on that, and your PowerPoint is another dimension to that. I think it is rarely a partnership of equals at the start, in my experience.
Well, I think we've discussed before, there's big charities I can only think of, probably less than 10 people who've gone from the volunteering world to be people director, and 2 of them on this podcast. But, it's so rare, and it shouldn't be. It really shouldn't be. So I think, that's one for another day, perhaps.
Well, I think the aspect of sort of power and the sort of conditions created in this in this kind of function, if you're integrating it, probably brings us to your session, Chris, which looked more at culture, which looked more at this idea of like the way we do things around here, and looked more at the sort of the different ways of working with within our community, both staff and volunteers. I wonder if it'd be useful for you to touch on some of those themes and any reflections from your session.
What we were trying to achieve for the session was those things, Matt, but really it was about saying, actually, as leaders, and most of the people in that room were people leaders, HR leaders or volunteering leaders. If you come from an HR background and you've got a responsibility for leading a cross function team effectively, and Rob's given us the context in terms of some of the challenges that exist in volunteering that maybe HR professionals may be less familiar with. For me, the session was about saying, well, actually, if you're delivering or supporting a function that's slightly different from HR, then here are some of the things you might want to talk about in terms of working with volunteers. And I think we've broadly focused on 3 different things. One was to recognise that if you want to get volunteers involved in organisation, it becomes less of a resourcing issue, in that, we often in HR, I hate the word HR personally, because human resourcing, it all sounds really horrible from a staffing point of view. But if you're just trying to bring people in as labour to get things done, that model is quite unusual to be successful in the modern world of volunteering. As we all know, volunteering often is much more about, we're competing for volunteers, is much more about customer service and making sure we provide a brilliant volunteer experience, bringing people together and making sure they want to come back for more and more time and time again. It's slightly different than the traditional functions of HR. Now, of course, I hope we've all worked in HR functions that are slightly more enlightened by that and are much more about helping people thrive and having a brilliant work experience. Where those 2 things happen, I think there's more scope quite often for synergy between HR and volunteering functions, because it is much more about the experience, much more about developing people. But then there's the other angle, which volunteering is much more increasingly about community organising, bringing around communities of people who are going to use their power, use their influence to make a difference in the communities they live in, or the buildings that they work in, or the causes that they work for. And again, that's much more about mobilising people than managing resources, managing people to do carry out roles and to carry out functions. So for me, that was about helping HR leaders think about, well, if that's the case from a leadership point of view, how do I need to structure my organisation slightly different? How do I need to develop my local managers or my team leaders with a different set of skills to be able to be a community organizer or a curator of experiences? They're different skill sets that you need them perhaps a normal business partner in an HR function might need. So for me, that's a leadership challenge about knowing what skills and what attributes do I need. And then we talked a bit about culture, and the cultural aspect of a department's really, really key. And if you've got a really compliance-led organisation, it's much harder to bring volunteering and compliance together. Not impossible, of course, but it's much harder. We talked a little about psychological contracts. What I mean by that is that despite what's written in the volunteers' role descriptions, there's almost an unwritten agreement, shall we say, between the volunteer and the organisation that they give their precious time to around what volunteering means to them and what their expectations would be of the organisation to meet those expectations around volunteering. And I think this is particularly important when we have lots of long-standing volunteers who, for them, not only did they give lots of their life to volunteering for an organisation, the cause is really central to their heart, but it actually represents a lot of how they see themselves as individuals, at least when they're at the volunteering place, but often beyond as well. So when we in organisations have even really simple, well-meaning ideas to affect change in the way that volunteering happens in our organisations, those well-meaning, perhaps sensible changes from a central point of view are interpreted very, very differently by volunteers on the ground who see this as a change to the safety of this psychological contract that they feel they have between their organisation and themselves. And I thought this is really important because, as we said, HR leaders perhaps have a range of perhaps different levers that they can pull in terms of managing staff. With volunteers, it's really important to be aware of that psychological contract and to realise that when perhaps sometimes volunteers dig their heels in over that what may seem from a centre as quite trivial things, there's actually some real psychological rationale behind it. And as people leaders, especially as senior people leaders, we need to be aware of that in our forward planning around change with volunteers, and we need to also upskill and enable volunteer managers with both the skills and the space to be able to manage those emotions effectively.
And it seems to me, Chris, that I'd be interested in Rob and Helen's reflections on this, but like almost what you've just talked about there is almost the answer to this, like, well, people aren't all people, right? It's almost the antidote to this, like, well, people are people. Well, here's some of the key reasons why it's not just people are people sort of thing. It's because, underneath this bit, particularly for volunteers, is this kind of very different and very interesting psychological contract thing going on, which is driving emotions. It's driving a whole heap of things which are quite different to other things that takes a particular kind of set of sort of skills and experience to some extent to really to understand and grapple with, and probably not just skills and experience, but also time and space to think through properly.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is to some extent I kind of go, yeah, we've known this for a while, right? The research that, I mean, I commissioned that research on, is there a difference between managing staff and volunteers? And if so, what is it and what do we do about it? We didn't call it that. You'll be relieved to know it had snappier title. But I commissioned that research when I was still the director of volunteering at the National Trust. That research that led to the work around emotional labour, the AVM toolkit around emotional labour. And I guess it's this critical thing for me about it isn't one isn't better than the other. Managing staff isn't better than managing volunteers. If you can manage staff but not volunteers, it doesn't make you better than if you can manage volunteers or not manage staff. It's just different. And acknowledging that it's different and takes different skills and has a different impact, and might certain aspects of that employee or volunteer journey might need more time than others at various stages. That's okay, but to not acknowledge that and to design teams as if it isn't different is rarely successful. And yet we still, I think, come across in organisations that we volunteer in or work in or consult to, we still come across that I always describe it as a well-intentioned but inaccurate sentence around, well, they're all people.
Yeah.
And you kind of tackled it in your remarks on Friday, Helen, about, it's not that managing volunteers is easy and managing paid staff is difficult, or vice versa. And it's interesting because it came up a couple of times on Friday, not in the context I'm going to specifically refer it to here, but about how some people can approach managing paid staff with the leaders of there are certain levers that you can pull over paid staff that you can't pull over volunteers, contractual levers and all of those kinds of things. But of course, we all know that when you start pulling those levers, that's not the way that you get the best out of people, is by pulling those levers and, making threats and holding back pay increases and all of those kinds of things, all of which aren't open. For me, it comes back to a kind of broader point about leadership. And I always go back to one of the books I read right at the start of my career, kind of 30 odd years ago, which was James Coos and Barry Posner's Leadership Challenge, which is written specifically for leaders of corporate organizations. And they specifically say in here, to get a feel for the true essence of leadership, assume that everybody who works with you is a volunteer. Assume that your employees are there because they want to be, not because they have to be. What conditions would need to exist for your staff to want to enlist in your volunteer organisation? Under volunteer conditions, what would you need to do if you wanted people to perform at high levels? And it's that, I almost kind of take it out of the HR volunteering dynamic. It's the broader thing of how do we get the best out of people?
Entirely there, Rob, but there's a challenge there for me, again, for leaders of a combined people function or of an HR function to kind of lead on that point right across the organisation, because it's often not the HR personnel who revert to those levers. It's often the middle managers or other members of staff, or maybe somebody in finance who will reach for the easier lever with staff, which is terms and contractuals, rules and conditions, and so on. And they reach for that for volunteer, and of course it doesn't work. Doesn't work for staff. I agree with you very often as well. So I think there's a leadership role for HR professionals if they're taking on a volunteering function, to say the culture of our organisation, hopefully, and our leadership approach is not to rely on those levers. It's about better understanding the human condition, better understanding how people think, anticipating people's needs and reactions, working with them to find solutions, all those kind of things, rather than pulling those levers. So I think that's a leadership function as well.
Absolutely agree.
I think levers are always interesting, particularly in the volunteer landscape. You find it's like you've got a set of levers sometimes, but you pull some of them and they don't do anything, or sometimes you pull on others and they do a different thing to what you thought they did. So yeah, it is definitely the idea of that is very interesting. And that brings us almost full circle, right? With some of that stuff, context is really key, right? It depends on where people are at. It depends where the organization's at. It depends what the issue is. So as you can probably all tell, that was one of my big takeaways from the event. I wanted to try and sort of round some of the things off, and I appreciate it hasn't been long since the event, but perhaps going to each of you to think, well, what was one of the things, or what was the kind of one of the key takeaways you took from the event? I don't know who would like to go first.
I'll start if you like, because I had to think. I had to think about this. So Well, with at the risk of sounding flippant, but not, we could just trust our guts a bit more, chaps, because 2 years ago we were thinking this was probably a useful thing to do, and we could probably trust our guts and go quicker. Is slightly flippant, but also there's some substance in that, because one of the biggest things for me was when we first launched it and people started to sign up or got in touch to ask us about it. The sheer number of people who said, "Oh my God, this is amazing that you've put this on because there's nowhere else." And the people who had been on an integration journey that had been running for years in cases who said, "I wish I'd had this at the beginning." So that sense that, for me, a really basic entry level takeaway is there is a need for more support and exploration around this, and people are interested in spending time on it and interested in working together on it. So no one was saying, "Can you do more of this, but can we have a separate HR session, or can we have a separate volunteering session?" There was energy and appetite, and there was energy and appetite to work together. And I think you saw that particularly when we did that very final session that Chris led, which was, okay, so we've had today, what else would you find useful in terms of additional support around this? And just the sheer number of ideas that people were coming up with, and the fact that they were coming up with ideas that was about them connecting as peers. So, people asking for open space sessions so that they can share their experiences. So a big takeaway for me was just how much people want to explore this more, and that they want to do this in an integrated way. And there is currently not a space where that happens. So need, I guess, need. And can I have a second one? And my
Of course.
second one is that across the board, and we know this, right, because we work in and around organisations all the time, but across the board, whether that people were in volunteering or in HR or something that was somewhere in between, people are working really, really hard to do the best that they can every single day. And we know that,
Yeah.
but sometimes this topic gets hostile and competitive and full of conflict. And it goes right back to what Catherine Ward said at the beginning in her opening session, where she talked about focusing on the gains. What can we gain by working better together? So remembering that every one of those people is working really hard to do the best that they can every day for people in their organisation, whether paid or unpaid. It was a beautiful, right in front of your face-to-face reminder of that. If I was allowed a third, which is cheating, I would say that there's value in face-to-face events, and that some topics are better explored face-to-face. And I'll shut up now.
But we don't need to do any more. But Helen's done all
I
three
know, I
for
was
us.
going to say I would have had one, but Helen's done all three of them there. What's the takeaway is that we like working together. I mean, I would also add that that having that many what was surprising, that many people want to go to Swindon on a Friday afternoon in November, or a Friday in November. That was quite a surprise. But being serious, I think I'll put a slightly different, maybe a slightly more negative spin on what Helen just said. How have we got to 2024 and there is this gap in the market still? How have we got to this point with, networks for HR people, with networks for volunteer engagement people, and we're having that conversation? And not only was it relevant to everybody in the room and everybody was excited, and, we were going into it thinking, is there a potential for more of these in future? And already, people were firing off ideas on the day. But we all posted on LinkedIn afterwards. Some of our sponsors have posted on LinkedIn. Shout out to Rostify and Investigo for sponsoring this. They have posted, and the response to all of that has been huge compared to the kind of response that we sometimes get to things on LinkedIn. Loads of enthusiasm, loads of great comments. And I've had comments from people in the States and people in Australia who are both going, we desperately need something like this where we are as well. So this isn't a charity sector in the Southwest. This isn't an England. This isn't a UK thing. This is a kind of challenge that we're seeing, I get the sense, right around the world. So maybe Chris and Helen and I are going to spend a lot more time on aeroplanes going and taking this overseas as well in future.
We weren't sure we'd fill the room at the beginning, were we?
This is true.
So, I can add one more thing to that, really, to make this even bigger, really. But I think it's important is think there's space for a conversation with CEOs as well.
Absolutely.
And not just about integration of volunteering HR, but about where volunteering sits in their organisations and what the other opportunities for integrating within the organisations are. Because I don't know if many of the decisions to where to place volunteering in structures are really again contextualised and well thought through, or whether they are, oh, Bob, you can take on this in your department, can't you? And I think a conversation about the pros and cons, the opportunities and threats of placing volunteering in different contexts and different structures in organisations is also probably a really fruitful and interesting conversation to be had.
We had that. Well, I certainly had a couple of conversations with people on Friday about how you can become a chief exec of a really large, well, it doesn't even have to be a large charity, but a large household name charity, and you have almost no experience, and you're not assessed on any experience of not necessarily working with volunteers, but understanding volunteering in a kind of strategic way. And I would agree with you, Chris. I think it goes to the point we were talking about earlier. There is lots here to unpick around the relationship between volunteer engagement and the people function. But it's not just that. It's the senior leadership, it's the boards, it's the operational delivery through middle managers. There's tons and tons and tons of stuff. Many, many layers to the onion. Absolutely.
It sounds to me there's probably, at least in this, another book, a world tour by the sounds of it. Potentially a Netflix series. And just probably more podcasts and things to explore. So plenty to be going on top of the wealth of resources and information that is already out there, and that is in the sort of collective power of the people that I have on this podcast, which is brilliant. So it feels to me that's a good place to sort of draw to a close with the amazing power of potential and sort of an exciting future with more work to do in this area, which is brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Helen. And thanks to Chris for 1 week only for joining our panel. It's been a great session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for hosting, Matt.